A couple of days ago, political scientist Ian Bremmer published a tweet where he pointed out the fact that the Venezuelan refugee crisis is essentially the second largest after the Syrian one, with 5.4 million of Venezuelans who already escaped their country. As you can imagine, this tweet gained a lot of notoriety, with users asking themselves why the situation is barely unknown. So, given the situation, I'm going to explain some interesting facts about the Venezuelan refugee crisis. The first one is basically about the number itself. While it is true that 5.4 million is an insane number, the truth is that the real number of Venezuelans who escaped their country could be quite higher. After all, these 5.4 million of Venezuelans are essentially those who entered legally to the countries where they decided to escape. So there is a vast and unknown number of Venezuelans who are not documented in the countries where they decided to escape. So this essentially means that the real number could be up to 7 or even 8 million refugees, which is extremely crazy. On the other hand, a very interesting detail is that this 5.4 million is the number that different authorities, that different institutions counted since the year 2014. So they are not counting the number of Venezuelans who escaped during the era of Hugo Chavez, who reigned in the South American nation between the years 1998 and 2012. And in this period of time, thousands of Venezuelans flee their country. So that is another interesting detail because it also points out the fact that the number could be considerably higher. Another fact about this terrible crisis that Venezuelans have been experiencing is essentially xenophobia, as you can imagine. Unfortunately, this is a phenomenon that has been taking place in some nations in Latin America, which is the region where the vast majority of Venezuelans have decided to escape. So a great example is Peru, where the xenophobia against Venezuelans is considerably high, with many Venezuelans pointing out on social media or even some articles on some media outlets that this type of discrimination is extremely high in Peru. On the other hand, we have been watching a very horrible phenomenon, which is essentially the fact that some politicians are taking advantage of this Venezuelan refugee crisis to exacerbate xenophobia. The greatest example of all is essentially the one of Bogota, which is the capital of Colombia, Bogota Mayor Claudia Lopez, who has been claiming a lot of false things about Venezuelans. She has been pointing out that Venezuelans are responsible for the vast majority of crimes that are committed in the capital city of Colombia, which is a lie considering that the same Colombian police have pointed out that if you take the total number of crimes committed in the city, only 2% are committed by Venezuelans. So this is something that we have been watching over the last few months, essentially. This is quite interesting because this phenomenon has increased during the pandemic, during the COVID pandemic. So it is essentially the typical strategy that many politicians use, that when their popularity goes down, they try to increase it by exacerbating fears. And there's nothing better than xenophobia, essentially. So another crucial fact about this refugee crisis is, the political crisis that this situation has created in several countries. So I'm going back to Peru. In Peru, during the last presidential election, during the primaries, there were many candidates whose main slogan was nothing more than deport the vast majority of Venezuelans. And unfortunately, those politicians, while they didn't end up being the main candidates, there were many people who decided to support them. In fact, the current president of Peru, Pedro Castillo, he recently said that every Venezuelan that commits any type of crime, they will be deported, with many institutions pointing out that this was something extremely discriminatory, because once this policy takes action, it's usually quite difficult to determine who is the real person that committed a crime and the person that doesn't commit that crime. So this is something quite concerning, actually. As a matter of fact, we also watched this phenomenon in the latest presidential elections in the United States, where Joe Biden and Donald Trump, they were both claiming that they were essentially the greatest option for the Venezuelan migrants who were living in the US. So what everyone needs to understand is the fact that this migrant crisis is not only a problem of Venezuela. This is something that is affecting several nations, especially in Latin America. So what many expect is that this particular crisis could have some unexpected outcomes. Like, for example, the rise of certain populist leaders who could rise only because they exacerbate xenophobia, and they can catch a really good number of votes. And of course, this could also create an economic crisis in some nations, considering the vast amount of Venezuelans that are forced to escape their country. Unfortunately, the undeniable fact of every single fact that I've been telling, the biggest one is that this is going to get worse over the next few years, because the crisis in Venezuela hasn't been solved. Venezuela keeps suffering an incredible crisis, which only result is going to be way more people escaping this South American nation. Reporting from Medellin, Colombia, Luis Orozco, Newsweek.